Okay, so sticking with the theme from the last video, we decided to do a list of 5 classics that we don't love. Same parameters as before. Pre 1993, we gave ourselves that 30-year buffer. It has to have at least a 7 out of 10 or higher on IMDb, and we're still sticking with the no horror movie picks. So, same as last time, Bryce, I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to you.
All right, thanks, man. I do want to say just before we start that the title of this video is very particular because, at least for me, I wouldn't say I hate any of these movies. I wouldn't say that, I even dislike a lot of these movies. I wouldn't say that these movies are bad. They're just classic movies that are renowned, have stood the test of time, are very popular, both with the general population and with film circles. Just things that, and in my case at least, I'm sure yours is the same, just things that aren't particularly my thing. So I just wanted to start off that because a lot of these are some people's favorite movies of all time, and some of these are considered the best movies of all time. So just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. Um, but I started off with an honorable mention, and it's sort of a symbolic honorable mention because it's just one film that sort of symbolizes a whole like type of film. But, I picked from 1931, City Lights, which is one of the most famous Charlie Chaplin silent films. I put this in here because I took a intro to film class as an elective in college. I do love film history. I do think it's interesting to read about. So obviously the silent movie era, Charlie Chaplin, these are things that are iconic to say the least and are so integral to getting films as they are. But just use this as sort of a symbolic placeholder for just not my thing. Um, Sort of why I put it as an honorable mention because it's something that I definitely respect. I definitely think the craft is well made for the time. It's so important in film history. But this whole silent film era, Charlie Chaplin thing, I've seen my fair share, and I know some, film buffs and film nerds that just go nuts over this stuff. But never been something I've really gotten into. I like my movies with dialogue, like my movies with modern styles of filmmaking. So yeah, just a very symbolic sort of honorable mention for that really classic era of Hollywood that I for sure appreciate, for sure respect, just not something I think I would ever throw on outside of the context of like a film class.
Interesting. So, real quick, I wanted to touch on what you said before you said your honorable mention. I completely agree with what you were talking about. Um, Both of us absolutely love cinema as a whole, and I think there's very few movies that I truly hate. So, sticking with what you said, these are just movies that other people praise that didn't necessarily do it for us. Going back to City Lights, I'll be honest, when you said this, I had no idea what you were talking about. Um, I don't get me wrong, I do consider myself a film buff, but I know my limits. Pretty much stuff prior to 1960s is stretching it. But I think I mentioned this in the last video. Unless it was a Universal monster movie, I probably haven't seen it if we're getting that old. And so, besides like a Casablanca, but I immediately Googled this. I found out the American Film Institute has this ranked as the 11th best American film ever made. So I think that just goes more with your point. And now I'm almost more curious to watch it just because I now I'm just intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, it's got, I feel like, at least how it was presented to me and to my understanding, like, if you were ever curious to check out like a Charlie Chaplin film, apparently this is the one to check out. Crosses or it checks off all the boxes. It's got the slapstick humor, it's got the silent nature of it and the comedy that would go with that, not being able to have like actual dialogue. So extent, it was cool to watch, being able to watch it in that context of a film class to appreciate it and sort of, for me, be able to appreciate how far cinema has come from this. But yeah, definitely has a very, very prominent place in film history, but it does not have a prominent place in my movie opinions and my movie watching.
That's fair.
Did you want to give your honorable mention, or do you want me to dive right into my
Oh,
number
I
five?
can I can go ahead and give mine just for I forgot that last time you didn't have one, which is I think why I went into
Mhm.
number five.
Yep,
Um,
go for it.
so my honorable mention is kind of a two for one because in my opinion they're the same kind of movie. So my honorable mentions are both Dazed and Confused and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Both of these movies are just your like wake and bake high school fun flicks that everybody that's my parents' age absolutely loves and adores, but it never really resonated to me. And part of it is because I think we just had a different high school experience. But the other part of it is these movies don't really have plots. Like they're fun, and there's a lot of references that are still used today, which is definitely cool. But I think unless you're truly into these kinds of movies, I don't think they'd resonate. Like as an example, I love like B action movies because I don't really care about the plot. I'm watching it for the action. I know not everybody's like that. And to me, this is that kind of thing where if you're into it, cool. Um, but to me, I don't like this isn't necessarily my thing. I've seen them both. I can say I've watched them, but it's not something that I would actively go out to rewatch no matter how many times my dad wants me to. It's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, I think that those are. I would definitely agree with that as well in principle. I have seen portions of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, like just over the years through like cable television, in between commercials. I've never seen Dazed and Confused, but I am familiar with both because I know people that like both. I've heard them talked about a lot um, in various places. So I know in general, what they are, sort of like what you pointed out. And I'd have to agree. I've never really been strong in like 80s nostalgia. And I feel like Fast Times at Ridgemont High is one of those iconic 80s movies that's just like full of like 80s-ness that I'm not particularly like a fan of. And then Dazed and Confused, like you pointed out, now I know that that's directed by Richard Linklater, and I'm familiar with some of his other work, and it is very much like I believe they call it like slice of life, where it's just no particular narrative, just following characters around for a while. And sometimes that can work great if done correctly. But for me, it's a very, very narrow bridge to walk. So it rarely gets done right. So I guess I can't say for certain with these two because I haven't seen them both in full. But in principle, I agree. Not a fan of that kind of that kind of film.
There's there's something to be said for being able to say that you've seen them, but that's about as far as I would go. Like I would say you should at least watch them, but like you said, this you have to kind of be into that slice of life. And I did just want to point out for the potential audience members, I am fully aware that Phoebe Cates coming out of the pool in Fast Times is like the greatest movie scene in all of history. I feel like if you talk to anybody who's our parents' age, that's like what they immediately go to. And so I promise I understand that. I just didn't want to make it. I feel like there could be people who'd be like, "Oh, you just didn't like Phoebe Cates' pool scene." So I just wanted to make sure I put that out there.
Was a article I read. I don't know how they judged this. I don't know if it had to do with like VHS tapes back in the day where, they start off where the previous person left off, but it was something like that scene was like the most paused scene of like any movie.
I've
Um,
read that exact same statistic.
it's like that, and then in what is it? It's the one where Sharon Stone like uncrosses her legs.
Uh, 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 Basic Instinct.
Right, yes. It was like that one and then the Fast Times at Ridgemont High pool scene. Those were like the two most paused movie scenes in history, so it makes
Yeah,
sense.
absolute legendary.
For sure. Okay. All right. I will dive into my official number five. Sort of similar vibes as City Light. I saw it first in the same context of my intro to film class. Um, It is very frequently touted as the greatest movie ever made. It almost is a meme now that when a new movie comes out, you say that it's no this film, and that is 1941's Citizen Kane from Orson Welles. Another one that's just now, granted, I would watch I would choose to watch this a million times out of a million over City Lights. A lot of modern filmmaking styles come from Citizen Kane. It was very revolutionary, whether it's like, you know, the narration, the nonlinear narrative, a lot of the way that it's structured is like how modern movies are structured. So it's sort of that transition period of 1941 from the silent movies and then like the 30s movies where they were still like figuring out what cinema is, and then this helps cement like this is how movies are going to be made from here on out. So a lot to appreciate. Once again, amazing craft, amazing writing. Orson Welles is one of the greatest directors. Such a prominent figure in film history. It's such a prominent film in film history. But it's just another one that I don't know. It's hard to really put a pin on it. It just still is a very antiquated style. Um, so it's hard for me to really resonate with and for me to really feel engaged. It is very slow, feels very long, and just was not something that I wouldn't say I didn't enjoy, but I would definitely say it wasn't my preferred thing to be watching. Now it is kind of cool for those of you who might not know what it's actually about, because I know for me, I just heard about it name dropped all the time, but I never actually knew what it was about. There's this very popular, very rich newspaper magnate, journalism magnate, who is basically like sort of like a story of his life, but the whole frame is he becomes this like curmudgeon, like miser, Scrooge like figure where people think he's just like a sellout and has no heart. And then as he dies, his last words are Rosebud, and he's like the most significant person in the world. So this journalist who hears his last words decides to investigate and see what the meaning of Rosebud was. Was the most powerful person in the world thinking as he died, and it's sort of like a story of his life. So there is some intrigue there. It's a very big central film mystery. I feel like the whole Rosebud thing has been also parodied everywhere. But once again, it's just something that's commonly touted as the greatest film of all time, and oh, it's no Citizen Kane has sort of like entered the modern vernacular. Wouldn't be something that to for a favorite film as far as I go.
So this one's interesting. To start off with, since I happen to already be here, the American Film Institute has ranked the greatest movies of all time twice, once in 1998 and one again in 2007. Both times they had Citizen Kane as number one. So I just want to point that out to drive your point home. I feel like a lot of people don't even have to be film buffs to have heard about Rosebud or, Citizen Kane being mentioned. And I don't necessarily dislike this movie, but I also don't love it. So I find this one like I can't. I feel like there is like we'll call it a meh category. Like I wasn't mad that I watched this movie, but it wasn't a complete letdown to me, like it may have sounded like it was to you. Um, so yeah, that one's definitely. I was curious if this one would end up on one of our lists, but yeah, I don't necessarily have much to say about it. I'm just gonna say meh. I do agree with what you said about how I don't like I completely appreciate it for what it is and what it was at its time, but I also don't know if it should be the standard for if a movie is good or not, if that makes sense.
Right. If it was just a 40s film out of that category, I'd probably like it a lot more. It's just the fact that it's always considered the greatest and the best.
Hmm. That's
So
completely a fair point.
definitely worth watching. Just sort of feels like more of the film you'd write an essay about, not watch for enjoyment.
Yes, that I would agree. Um, I have something I want to say, but I want to wait until the end of your list because there's a movie that now I'm curious if will be on your list, and so I don't want to bring up the discussion now just in case. So I'll table it for later. If you remember, please remind me. Um, so my number five. I I did this list after doing the first list, and so my number five is a complete parallel to my previous number five. which I won't spoil. Go watch the video. But similar with the whole King of Cult Classics idea, it is 1987's Raising Arizona. This has a 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb, and similar to my previous number five, this gets talked about a ton as one of those cult classics that when it came out was absolutely terrible, but then over the course of 3+ decades, it has just this insane cult following. And I watched this for the first time maybe a year ago. My dad was like, "Oh, if you like Nicolas Cage, this is like his best movie." And I feel like that's what I've heard a lot when I watch reviews or I read stuff. And this just wasn't necessarily for me. So this is one where I could totally understand if it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, this isn't my kind of humor. So of course a bunch of people are going to like it, and that is completely okay. But for me, this just wasn't my kind of humor. I don't even want to necessarily call it deadpan, and I also don't want to call it like stupid humor because like you can tell the people are being clever and it just doesn't resonate. So just as like a setup, if people haven't seen it, a husband and wife deal babies and they have a family. That's like the that's like the best way I can explain it without spoiling stuff. But it's just like I don't know, it's almost like Napoleon Dynamite before Napoleon Dynamite, but also that's not even a fair comparison. I don't know. I probably should have thought through explaining this more, but this is just like one of those cult classics that I just couldn't get behind.
Yeah, I have never seen this, and I don't really know too much about it. Probably this description that you just gave is the most I've really heard about it. I think is this what Nick Cage won his Oscar for? I can't remember.
I'm not 100% sure, but I will be back in a second.
Okay. Yeah, it's one of those
uh,
films I think it's also the Coen brothers, an early Coen brothers film. I think I could just have my film facts horribly wrong on this one.
yes, it is the Coen brothers. They both
Okay.
wrote and directed it.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, I have not seen this one. Sort of a side note, I'm not a huge fan of the Coen brothers in general. I think their style of comedy is very unique, I guess I should say, to them, and it is not my style of comedy. So sort of like what you were saying, where you're like, that it's supposed to be clever, but it wasn't quite hitting. I'm the exact same way.
So just to answer your question from earlier, he won his Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas in
Ah,
1996.
okay. Okay, okay. Um,
Yeah, I was about to
but
say if
yeah,
he
I
won for this, I would be a little surprised, but I don't vote on the Oscars, so.
right. Yeah, well, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of the Coen brothers sort of style of comedy. So if this one really is just like a leaning into the comedy, I probably would not enjoy it much either.
Yeah, this isn't even necessarily one that I can recommend to say like, hey, you should watch it just to say you have.
100%. Oh, okay. All right. My number four. This is one that hurts to put on this list because it was something that's been so hyped for me and it had everything going for it for why I might like it. And it just completely fell flat. Two times I've tried to watch it. Both times I've fallen asleep. So I've seen it in portions, never seen it all the way through. Um, but it is 1959's Ben-Hur. So, spoiler alert for the last list. Planet of the Apes is one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm a big Charlton Heston fan. I think he is one of my favorite. I don't know if you could call him classic because I know classic has a specific date range of like the 30s and 40s and whatnot. And I know we're calling these classics, but you know what I mean. Like I wouldn't call him an actor of like classic Hollywood. Maybe I don't know. But all that to say, I'm a big fan of his work. I love Planet of the Apes. I love Soylent Green. I really love the Ten Commandments. All these movies that he's in, these big epics. So I finally got around to checking out Ben Hur, which is one of his, um, which is often touted as like the best biblical epic of all time. And I watched it, like I said, twice. Fell asleep. Twice had to watch it in pieces, and I was just kind of let down. Now, there's so much to respect about this movie. Incredible set pieces, incredible costume design. They pretty much built a hippodrome to have a chariot race in. And it's a great story. I've read the book. The book is also sort of similar. It is based on a book. For those who don't know the story, it's about a Jewish noble named Judah Ben-Hur who befriends a Roman, and the Romans are occupying Judea. It's the first century AD, around the time that Jesus is living. And basically, they're friends when they're younger, and when they grow up, the Roman friend gets in a position of power and basically double crosses the Judah Ben-Hur for being a Jewish noble, and basically screws him over and puts him into slavery. And it's about his story of Judah Ben-Hur's story of getting revenge, redemption, and a lot of other things. So a lot of great themes, really great setting. It is an epic. It is just unbelievably slow, and for me, very unbelievably boring for large portions. So I got to say, I was pretty disappointed with this because it had everything going for it for me to love it, and it just did not jive with me. I've given it 2 opportunities. Maybe I'll give it a third someday if I'm really in a mood for a biblical epic, but if I ever am looking for a biblical epic with Charlton Heston, I am 100 times out of 100 going for the Ten Commandments because I do think that is an awesome film.
Yeah, this one's an interesting one because I think this may be the first one that nope, never mind. I haven't seen City Lights. I have not seen Ben-Hur. I am of course familiar with it, but I'm trying to find the official stats because I wanted to confirm before I say this. I know it's one of like the top 10 longest movies of all time. And I am getting better. Or I should say I am better because there's a lot of really long movies that I have sat through. Definitely as a kid, if it was longer than an hour and a half, you would have to, you know, it'd have to be like amazing for me to watch it, which I know sounds bad. So nowadays, much better. Um, however, because of that, I was immediately turned away by just how long it was. And so I can't necessarily comment on it other than just knowing about, like you said, the amazingness that went into actually creating the film. But I didn't even watch the remake.
Right. And here's the thing is like, I mean, I'm not saying that long movie is the problem. I mean, the Ten Commandments is almost just as long, and I've watched that all the way through a couple times. I love that movie. So it's not that. It's just, I just don't think this one, I don't know. I guess in a way, I just don't think this one had necessarily the story to justify being this long because, yeah, I don't know. It just felt out. It felt like it was really drawing things out. It did not have to be that long, but I know it actually is tied for winning the most Oscars, though. It won 11 Oscars, believe it or not.
Interesting. That I actually that doesn't surprise me. Like
It's,
you pointed out, it there's a lot of good stuff that went into that movie.
I believe it is tied. I'm about to confirm this, but I believe it's tied with Return of the King and Titanic for winning the most Oscars.
While you're looking it up, I will just add, going off of what you said, that that makes a ton of sense. That Ten Commandments is almost as long, but it just has a story that keeps you interested longer. That was a thing for me when I was a kid. It generally felt like the longer movies were not as good at keeping interest, so it didn't feel like they were justified for being that long. The director just wanted them to be, or writer, whoever was the creative mind behind that time frame. And so I can completely understand if Ben-Hur feels like it drags, why it wouldn't necessarily keep your interest.
Yes, so it won 11 Oscars, and it adjusted for inflation is the second highest grossing film in history after Gone with the
And
Wind.
got yep. I was about to show the film now. The ironically, I will just add, I know I'm going to mention a lot about how I watch a lot of classic movies with my dad. Gone with the Wind is one that's one of my mom's favorite movies of all time. And so even though it's, I want to say almost 4 hours long, I have seen that one on multiple occasions because I'll just watch it with her.
I'll probably give it another watch at some point. My mom really likes it, so I'm sure maybe we'll watch that at some point.
Um, okay, so going on to my number four, this is where I break your heart. It is 1968's 2001: A Space Odyssey. It has an
How
8.3 out of 10
dare
on
you?
IMDb. And honestly, I'm gonna clip what you said, put it here, and no, I'm just, uh, I completely understand that is groundbreaking for its time. I give Kubrick all of the praise, all of the respect, even the actors involved, the writers, everybody on that set, everybody who made that movie deserves just complete praise, and I promise I understand that. My problem is I don't personally feel like it holds up today. And what I mean by that is, so this is one that I hadn't seen until maybe a year and a half ago. It got a bunch of it became viral for a little bit because a lot of the stuff in there was being called for nowadays, specifically like with the AI. So maybe it was more like a year ago, whenever the AI boom really started. And my dad was like, "Hey, I was reading all about this. Have you ever seen it?" And I was like, "Well, I know it exists. I'm familiar with the plot." And but I've never actually seen it. Do you want to watch it? Yeah, sure. It's on Max, whatever it was. So then we sat down to watch it, and it just didn't do it. He gave up like 45 minutes in. I kept going, so I promise I did see the whole thing. And once again, it was very cool to be like, "Oh, this was 1968 and they did this. Oh, it was 1968 and they did this." But besides the coolness of seeing his forethought of where society would go, it doesn't necessarily hold it for me. And I remember you saying in your in you before talking about how you understood that it's not for everybody. I just happen to be in that not everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It definitely is not for everybody. But I do think it speaks to anyone who thinks that, oh, he's got a short attention span. He can't, watch long movies like Ben-Hur. Well, I love 2001, and like 5 minutes of that is literally blackness with score. So
You know,
that takes a lot of patience.
I said this after we finished recording the previous video. The audience will be able to tell the kinds of movies you like versus the kinds of movies I like, and I'm totally not going to do myself justice. I promise I enjoy like true dramatic cinema. cinema. It's just this just happens to not be one of them.
For sure. Um, yeah, I mean, I can't really do much of like a rebut. Just watch the other video, and then you'll see all the reasons why I would like it. But okay, I'll move on to number three. And this sort of goes on to a parallel with a video that I had that I loved last time. Um, it's another Hitchcock film. Um, as you know, I liked Rear Window the last time. This is a movie that Hitchcock made with Jimmy Stewart after Rear Window came out, and that is 1958's Vertigo. So, Vertigo, kind of a weird story. It's basically, Jimmy Stewart plays this detective in San Francisco who has to retire because he had this bad incident while catching a perp, and he develops this like fear of heights, and he gets a really bad sense of vertigo. And so he basically is retired, and he gets hired by this guy who he used to know, sort of as like a private investigator, to follow the guy's wife, who he thinks is like up to something because she's like acting really strange. And it's sort of about him following her and sort of uncovering this mystery that like the wife is involved in and whatnot. And I think the reason I would say I just don't love it is because once again, it's one of these movies that people say it's Hitchcock's best. It's one of the best like thrillers of all time. This, that. I've seen so many people give it like 4.5 or 5 out of 5 stars. And I think I watched it. I think I gave it like a 3 or 3.5 out of 5 because I was like, that's fine, but like I don't love it. It's I guess like the truest testament to why I don't love it is because the whole point is this like intriguing mystery about like this woman and what she's up to and like the secrets behind that. And I've watched it several times and I can't even tell you what the mystery is, what the secret is because it's just not memorable to me. Um, just nothing about it particularly stood out. Like, with Rear Window, there's like the unique nature of the plot. There's I think it built a lot of intrigue better, a lot of the mystery. I was much more involved in the mystery of the murder there. In this case, it's just I know it's a very long movie. It's longer than Rear Window, and it goes on for quite a while. Another story that I think didn't have enough narrative to warrant the runtime. And yeah, it's just nothing about it really stuck out to me. So I wouldn't say, like I said in the beginning, I wouldn't say I hated it, wouldn't say it's a bad movie, but definitely did not stand out as something that would be considered A, Hitchcock's best, or B, one of the best thrillers ever made. And it also gets in I'm not a very artsy person when it comes to movies, and this one in particular takes a lot of time to sort of cut these like psychedelic, artistic sort of things, like at various points, like when the main character starts to develop vertigo, it sort of goes into these weird, trippy sequences that take up cumulatively quite a bit of runtime. They come in weird spots, and it's just not something that I vibed with. But yeah, so that's Vertigo. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have seen Vertigo, and before I offend more people, I would just like to say I promise I don't despise all all classic films. Um, we're specifically not doing horror, so like I love some of my favorite movies of all time. Wait Until Dark, Eyes Without a Face, Bucket of Blood. Like I promise, I enjoy a lot of classic movies. However, I completely agree with you. And this is another one where I don't want to necessarily say I'd put it in the meh category, maybe like meh -1. This is one that I wouldn't necessarily say would make a top 5 list for me of like ones I don't enjoy. This is like that's why I was kind of saying I'd put it in a meh. But just wanted to kind of cover my butt there because I feel like I'm starting to go on a roll where it's like, oh, was it made in 1950? I don't like it. But yeah, no, I pretty much agree with everything you said as far as Hitchcock. I feel like this one actually gets heralded a lot as being one of his best, and I just don't necessarily agree.
Yeah, no, for sure. It just like it wasn't particularly offensive. Like I can't remember anything about it that was like bad. But like I said, it's just something that I can't even remember like what the main, you know, big reveal is at the end or whatever, because I just can't remember because it's just not particularly memorable. Anything about it. I will say though, one of the thing that always struck me as weird throughout this is I know Alfred Hitchcock likes to work with Jimmy Stewart. He's appeared in so many of his films, but at this point, he was getting pretty up there in age. And I think that the script was definitely written for like a younger actor because there's like weird points in the movie where it sort of seems to allude he's like on the younger side, but Jimmy Stewart's like 60 playing him, and they make him do stuff in the plot that just seems like that was supposed to be like a younger actor. And the whole thing with like the wife is like she's like this really good looking like woman in like her late 20s early 30s, and he's like double her age, and there's sort of like a weird like sexual energy there that I just feel like it was meant for like a much younger better looking actor, and then Hitchcock was like, no, I'm putting Jimmy Stewart in it. But that's just a side note.
So, quick aside, not to derail, but I should have mentioned this in the other video. I just forgot about it. I ended up discovering that there is a really funny what if, and I'm curious what you would think about this. What if It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart, was made by Alfred Hitchcock? Thoughts?
That it'd have to have like some sort of twist, like, oh, just kidding, the world is better without you in it.
Apparently, that's actually like a pretty big what if, based like what you just said, where it's like, well, Jimmy always does stuff with Alfred. Apparently, there are a bunch of people who will ponder if It's a Wonderful Life was made by Alfred Hitchcock, and I never really thought about that, so I just thought that was funny.
We have some weird, trippy, surreal sequences.
Yeah, the dream state would be very different. Um,
For sure.
Okay, so moving on to my number three, this one may be a shocker. And I see the parallel with my previous video because, of course, I mentioned Mel Brooks. This comes from one of the other really big comedic creators of the time, and this is 1975's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It has an 8.2 out of 10 on IMDb, and this one's very interesting. So if you think about this era, you essentially have Mel Brooks, National Lampoon, Monty Python. These three groups were creating like every famous uh, uh, comedy of that time. They all are heralded as classics. And growing up, this movie gets referenced so much, and people will be like, "Oh, what? You haven't seen Holy Grail? Oh man, you got to watch Holy Grail." I feel like so I do this to other people with movies, so I totally understand it. The one that was done the most to me growing up was How have you not seen Holy Grail? So finally, I think it was freshman or sophomore year of college, I was like, I'm going to watch Holy Grail. And I don't know if it was that it had just been talked up so much to me that I felt like it didn't hit the bar, or what exactly it was. I did not laugh at this as much as I think I was supposed to. Don't get me wrong. The couple scenes that get referenced are very funny, but a couple scenes in a full movie just doesn't really do it for me. And I feel like a lot of people would say that Holy Grail is one of the greatest comedies ever made. So because it gets put that high, and I don't personally think it is, that is why I put it on this list. I'm not necessarily trying to say it's a bad movie. There are definitely funny parts, but to me, I don't think it's as good as everybody says it is.
Could not disagree with you more there, my friend. I adore this movie. I have probably watched it 100 times, and I need to watch it 100 times more. It's something I incessantly quote, even people who have seen it, not seen it. I quote it all the time. It used to be actually even back in the day when my brother and I had to share an iPod. We would literally like buy and download like audio clips from the movie as like part of the songs. Like our parents would let us buy a certain number of songs, like a month or whatever, and we would literally just like buy audio clips of like prominent jokes in the movie. I don't know, man. I just think it's so funny. I don't know. I watch it and I die laughing every time. Like I watched it for the first time as like 8 years old and like didn't even get any of the jokes. And then now like I totally get like all the jokes and I think it's hilarious.
So if
Um
I remember correctly, I think when I mentioned Princess Bride is when you said, "Hey, maybe it's one of those things that since I didn't watch it when I was young, it's not like a nostalgic factor." And so I'm curious if that's what it was for me with Holy Grail. Maybe if this is one that I had watched as a kid, I would have that to go off of, and when I would go back to watch it, be like, "Oh, this is still as funny as when I was a kid." Maybe it's because I watched it when I was already an adult. I'm unsure. And it's apparently on Netflix, so maybe I should give it a rewatch and I would change my mind. But I very vividly remember, like when we agreed to do this, I knew my top three right off the bat, and then I had to think about the bottom ones. Like I just vividly remember being relatively disappointed by Holy Grail. And once again, not a bad movie. It just didn't hit the bar that everybody had set it at for me. And so I think that's why it just didn't I didn't get a good feeling when I was watching it.
Totally understandable, but I really dig it. And honest, I've actually never seen any other Monty Python content. Like never seen like Flying Circus, never seen Life of Brian. Definitely stuff I've been meaning to check out. But I think if I like that this one, I might definitely like those as well.
And that's what's funny. So the only other one I've seen is Life of Brian, and I do like Life of Brian. So maybe I should just rewatch Holy Grail and this list would completely change. I watched Life of Brian much later after Holy Grail, and I did enjoy that one. So that's actually probably maybe I should just rewatch it, but for the time being, I have to put Holy Grail here.
Sure, definitely have to give it another watch. So my number two, we are double dipping with Hitchcock. I promise I like Hitchcock. There's quite a few of his films that I do like. Just he's just a filmmaker that rightfully so is lifted up as like one of the greatest directors and has some of the greatest films. So naturally, some of his films I'm going to view as overrated because they're touted as like the best of the best, and I might think they're just all right, like I did with Vertigo. But this one I like significantly less than Vertigo. I think if there was a movie on this list, I would say like I just actually did not like it. It probably would be this one. It is 1963's The Birds. So sort of, I guess I cheated a little bit. Some people consider it a horror movie. I really don't. I think it's more just like a straightforward thriller. But The Birds, as the name suggests, on the surface, it's about this town where these birds go crazy and start attacking people. But on the face of it, that sounds like a birdemic level of like, oh, that's fun. That's just like a weird horror movie about, you know, how there's like Jaws exploitation films. I know this predates Jaws, but just like the idea of like, oh, birds go crazy because birds are everywhere, and what would that look like? And that sounds on its basis like it could be a good just horror movie. But if you actually watch this movie, it's got so much, so much other stuff, so much like baggage in it that I just did not think jived with, I guess, a little bit unfair of me, but what I wanted in the movie just based on the premise and how I feel like it failed to deliver that. There's like this whole like romance thing, and it's like this woman is stalking this man to this town because she met him in a store, and like she wants to fall in love with him even though she doesn't know like who he is, and like they keep like dealing with this romance and this weird sexual tension between the two as like this incident happens with these birds attacking, and there's like there's no explanation or no like follow up about like why these birds did what they did. And then like you look it up and it's like Hitchcock was saying it's supposed to be a film about like sexual violence, like all these themes about how like passion for love can turn into like passion for violence, and it's also like an environmental message, and it's just like, wait, what are you doing? Like, what are you going for? This is a movie about birds attacking people. Why are you adding in all this stuff about like sex and violence and relationship tensions and stuff? And I don't know, it's slow, it's long, it's boring, everything, everything that would just make this not an enjoyable experience. Anytime the bird action gets good, it cuts to some weird relationship moment about this couple trying to maybe fall in love or maybe, get violent with each other and die. Who knows? But just a story I'm not invested in whatsoever.
Yeah, so I correctly guessed your number one for the classics you love. This is what I thought would be your number one for the classics you don't. You have been very vocal in the past about how much you despise this movie. So I guess I will take my L. But yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with you for the most part. This to me was pitched as a horror movie, so I always think of it as one, and it's just not. It's not scary. There's really not much more I can say about it. I mean, a lot of people when I've talked to them, they're like, "Well, Jacob, you have to look past the the fact that the birds aren't actually attacking them, and you can clearly tell it's a screen, and they're doing the best they can with the movie magic at the time." And you're talking to somebody who enjoys the blob. Like, I promise I'm okay with classic special effects, but I completely agree with you that the story is just slow, it's boring, and it's not one of my favorite Hitchcocks.
Yeah, I mean, just the point I really would just emphasize is I just don't know what it's trying to be, because it's like the birds themselves are like tertiary to the plot, and it's like it's a weird. I feel like you could have told a much better story that makes a lot more sense about this, like, you know, the passion of love, and then how that can lead into passion, whatever, sex and violence and relationship tension or whatever else he was trying to go for. It's just like a weird mix of things. I just feel like there could have been a better story for that than a story about birds attacking people. Like, it just feels like two totally separate ideas that he tried to mix together, and I just don't think it worked at all.
So what's funny about this is Tippi Hedren is one of the like classic actresses, and a lot of people consider this to be her best movie. And so that's how I originally watched it. I was on a bender where I was trying to go through the different classic actors and actresses and watch their top films. And even moving away from Hitchcock, I also wouldn't agree that this is one of her best films, if not what some people say is her best film. So I just wanted to add that part in it as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I watch it again with the mindset of this is some like romantic drama, then maybe I'll appreciate it more. But like when you have a movie and you market it on it being like a horror thriller, and it's just not, it just kind of throws me off and gives me everything that I don't want.
Uh, Random fun fact before I move on. Tippi Hedren is Dakota Johnson's grandmother. Just random fun fact.
It's a very weird comparison or a very weird connection.
Yeah, you would not think that at all, but apparently it's true. Um, so my number two is 1970s MASH. It has a 7.4 to 10 on IMDb, and this movie was so popular that it spawned a TV show that went for 11 seasons, and MASH is heralded as one of the greatest TV shows of all time. So there's a part of me that feels kind of bad for putting it here because I personally think a lot of the love for this movie stems from that TV show, and they're completely different. So MASH is just focusing on the medical unit of this military group, and so that's the only plot. The if I remember correctly, only one actor from the movie even translates to the TV show. However, even if my theory is that it's because of the TV show, this movie gets so much praise. And this is another one that was one of my dad's favorites. I'd watched the TV show with him and it was hilarious. And so I was like, okay, I'm more than willing to watch the movie. It's star-studded and it didn't ring. And I'm going to use something you said earlier when we were talking about Dazed and Confused and Fast Times. It is 70s humor. A lot of it is, we'll say, slice of life for the 70s. And so I'll be honest, maybe I just didn't get it. Maybe I did not laugh like he did because I did not live in the 60s. And so because it's 1970, so I should say 60s. And so I just didn't, like, a lot of it was not funny. And I think it's because it just didn't resonate with me as a younger person, is probably the best way I can put it.
Yeah. I've never actually seen the movie, but my dad is a huge fan. I feel like every, I don't know, suburban dad over 40 is like obsessed with this show. So I've seen like select episodes of the show just like throughout the years, like when my dad was watching. I've never actually seen the movie. The show wasn't really my thing. I'm not a huge like I know it's not like a war movie or sorry, like a war show or whatever necessarily, but not a huge fan of like that sort of genre. I actually didn't know it was supposed to be funny. Is it supposed to be like a comedy or?
Yeah, it's a complete comedy. I mean, they don't even like they're in a war, but they don't even focus on the war. Like
Okay.
the it's kind of just, and this is gonna sound really bad. What stupid hijinks can I get into? Like a classic like 70s kind of comedy thing. What stupid hijinks can I get into and then how do I get out of them and it's going to be funny. But like listen to this cast. Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, Tom Skerritt, Robert Duvall, and the list goes on. Like you would expect it to be awesome. And I don't want to downplay the actors cuz they did fine. Like this is why I really think it's just that I did not grow up in the 60s so it didn't resonate. But yeah, like it just doesn't click with me. Yeah, I really should preface that. It's not a bad movie. The actors do perfectly fine with the script they're given. It just really does. It's just one of those things that I just did not get. Is the best way I can put it.
Totally feel you on that. The show wasn't really the show's kind of that vibe. I think the show kind of takes it is a little bit more serious, dramatic than this sounds. But
Um, Real quick, so the IMDb synopsis is the staff of a Korean War field hospital use humor and hijinks to keep their sanity in the face of the horror of war. So that's kind of like that's the whole movie is just what's the next thing the group is going to get in the middle of and how are they going to get yelled at. That's all. That's like the best I can say.
okay. Maybe I'll check it out at some point. Maybe my dad will watch it and I'll just watch it with him at some point randomly.
There you go.
I've never actually heard him talk about the movie, only the show. But like you said, it seems like they're kind of detached because they have like mostly different actors.
Mhm.
Um, okay, all right, this is it, the number one. Um, so I didn't necessarily rank this list like by how much I dislike it. I kind of ranked it a little bit in terms of like what I thought the reaction would be to tell people that I did not love it. Like I think most people can get why I wouldn't actually like Citizen Kane. You know, most people wouldn't like would get how I wouldn't like something like City Lights, but this is one that I really have not met anyone really that sort of shares this opinion. And once again, this is not a movie that I hate. This is not a movie that I think is bad. I think I gave it like a 3 out of 5. Maybe I could be 3.5 out of 5. But This is a director I really respect. I like a lot of his stuff, and this is just not my kind of film. But it is. This is the most recent movie that I've had on these lists. It's from 1990. It's Goodfellas. So I am not a fan of mob movies. Just right off the bat, kind of already disqualifies this one. But I am not a fan of mob movies. This one, it is the story of a Irish, Italian, American mobster, Henry Hill, who was a real figure. It's based on, I think it was either an autobiography or like a memoir or biography of him. But it's about how he rose up in the Italian mob from the 50s through the 80s before eventually getting arrested. It has a classic, directed by Martin Scorsese. It has a classic Scorsese cast with Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Ray Liotta, who is the star, and he's great. Everyone's great. Listen, there's a lot about this movie that's great. Mob movies just aren't my thing. So I watched this and it has. I understand that a lot of mob tropes probably came from this movie because this is like the mob movie. But for me, watching it now in the present, it just felt like it had every trope of a mob movie in the books, every gangster movie, every mob movie, every crime movie sort of just felt like it was just full of those tropes. And so that made the experience watching it not the most enjoyable, not the thing that I would tend to like the most, especially being a genre that I don't particularly care for already. Like I said, I think the performances are great. Scorsese's an amazing director. Um, but yeah, it just feels like mob movie, the movie, which some would say is kind of, but that's not going to be something that I would like as someone who doesn't like that genre to begin with.
Okay, this one's an interesting one because it's not like Holy Grail where you wholeheartedly disagreed because you love the movie. I'm not the biggest Goodfellas fanatic. Mob movies are not necessarily my favorite subgenre, but I do enjoy the occasional one, and I did like this movie. But I'm not mad that you're putting it here. Like I don't want it to be on the same level as Holy Grail, where it sounded like you really loved that movie and I just didn't. With Goodfellas, it's not like it's my favorite movie, but I do. And I think what you said is pretty accurate. This is like the mob movie that inspired other mob movies, and so it has all of the stereotypical tropes. But I just like it. So that's all I can real like I don't everything you said is completely accurate, and I think part of it is just that you made this that or that you don't like the genre. But yeah, this is one of my dad's favorites, so I've been watching this since I was able to understand what the mob is. And so I think maybe part of it is nostalgia, but yeah, this is definitely not one of my favorites, but it is one that I like. So I would disagree slightly.
Um, and yeah, I mean, definitely it's quotable, it's recognizable, it's iconic. It's one of those sort of like Ben-Hur where, we've established I can cover myself. I do like long movies if done right. Scorsese obviously makes really long movies. This one's another one that's like 3 hours long. Another movie where I felt like the story they were telling didn't quite warrant the runtime that it has because it is 3 hours, and some of Scorsese's movies that are 3 hours keep that momentum. They keep that spark, like Wolf of Wall Street, I think keeps up the peppiness to keep you intrigued and keep you going. This is one where it definitely fizzled out for me. I was pretty invested like the beginning, but then as it just kind of gets into the almost like slice of life. Like I know it's leading up to his arrest, but it's sort of just like, hey, look what this guy got up to for 30 years in the mob. Naturally, the story is going to kind of start to get a little flat where it's kind of just like him just, you know, chilling as a mobster and the stuff he got into and stuff like that didn't particularly interest me. So I felt like that particularly dragged, especially when it was getting into a 3 hour runtime. So not Scorsese's best, in my opinion, contrary to what I think the majority of people probably would say, which is why I put it at number one.
No, that's definitely fair. Um, I'm double checking one thing before yeah, okay. So my personal favorite Scorsese is The Departed, but I probably would put Goodfellas second. So if we're going off of that. But generally speaking, I also want to just restate mob movies are not like my favorites. Just in the vacuum in which we're talking.
for sure.
So, my number one is the reason why I dreaded doing this list because I know you're a fan of this genre, but I don't know if you like this movie. And so I'm curious if this is going to spawn a little bit of a heated debate. I'm going to do a little bit of prep before I reveal the movie. In my last list, I had Die Hard. And I talked about how Die Hard revolutionized the action movies that followed. And most of them reference Die Hard. It is just a pillar in the action movie community. And this movie is a pillar in the sci-fi community. It is often talked about as being an inspiration for so many sci-fi movies that came after it. And so of course I had to watch it, and I just don't agree. Um, I know you were talking about how The Birds would be the closest thing you would have to a movie that you actually hate. I don't hate this movie, I promise, but it's about as close as physically possible. It's one where, and we're going to get to another one of these in another list that we do, but this is definitely a movie that I was kind of mad that I sat through. Like normally I'm like, oh, okay, it's not a, I don't feel bad that I wasted my time. Like at least I got to watch it. This is one where I wanted my time back. And I'll go ahead and reveal it is 1982's Blade Runner, 8.1 out of 10 on IMDb. This is often heralded as one of just the greatest movies ever made, and I wholeheartedly disagree. I'm not gonna. This could definitely be biased, but I just generally like I just don't like it. And it's not necessarily a I don't get it. We covered this in a film class. We did a deep dive. I've watched tons of videos to try and see if I was just missing something, and I don't think I am. I this is just like so I watched this for the first time when they were making the sequel because the sequel's trailer looked awesome. So I was like, okay, I should watch the first one to be prepared for the second one. Watching the first one made me not want to watch the second movie. I don't know if it's good. I haven't watched it, but this first one, I just the it seems like I'm not completely alone. It seems like this movie, for how much it is heralded, is a relatively polarizing movie. And so I don't necessarily feel terribly bad for saying that I do not like this. It seems like I'm not alone, but I like when we said, "Hey, what are five classics you don't like?" Immediately, what came to my mind was Blade Runner. And
Yeah.
I
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry. No, you're good. I'll go ahead and let you, because I could just I could just keep sitting here going, I don't like it, I don't like it for a while. So I'll you go ahead and say something.
Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of Blade Runner. I I mean I think I like it more than you, just sort of based on what you've said. I'm not going to be like a big defender of it, but in general, I think you're very on point there. It is very slow. It's very bleak, very sort of emotionless and cold, which doesn't make the experience any more enjoyable. Um, Ridley Scott likes to try and pull off these like really highbrow like ideas and themes that don't quite come out right. He tried that with like Prometheus and Alien Covenant, and it didn't quite come out well. Um, the logic of the movie doesn't really make too much sense. Like I know it kind of gets ripped to shreds when people like think about the logic of like the replicants and like the central doesn't really make sense. Um, yeah, one of those that you definitely have to see just for sci-fi sake, but I honestly don't know if I'd watch it again. I do need to see the sequel though. I have not seen the sequel.
I want to just touch on something you said because so this was Ridley Scott's third movie that he ever directed. And he was coming off the heels of Alien, which, whatever you may or may not think about Alien, I absolutely love that movie. I think that movie is done really, really well. So it's just
Yeah.
that much more insane to me how much I didn't like Blade Runner. And I also agree completely with what you said. The minute you start thinking about anything, it just completely falls apart, in my opinion. And I know I said earlier, well, I will sometimes watch movies just because I enjoy the action. I don't care about the story. And that is technically still true. But if I'm doing that, I want the movie to be fun. I want there to be reasons for me to watch and not care about the story. And I just don't think it has any of it. Like you said, it's slow, it's bleak, it's emotionless, and the it doesn't warrant me to be like, oh, I still recommend this if you just want a movie to turn your brain off for. It feels like it's supposed to be something you have your brain on, and yeah, like you said, maybe recommend it because it's one of the best movies ever made, and you should watch it. But in my personal opinion, I think you can just save yourself a couple hours and not sit through it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like half the runtime is just like, look at this futuristic city with all these holograms, while like it's raining and Harrison Ford just looks like nothing.
There
And
are there are some people, and I don't want to get in the middle of this one because I'm not a huge Star Wars fan either, but there are a bunch of people who say that Blade Runner, actually, don't even let's not even use Star Wars. There are people who say Blade Runner is Harrison Ford's best movie over Indiana Jones, and that shocks me.
that should not be legal to have that opinion.
Yeah, it's there. I always see people get mad that they rank Blade Runner for him over Star Wars, but they rank it over Indiana Jones, which is just like you said, it's blasphemy.
Blade Runner for me is something that I think on paper could be a good idea, but I think it needed, I think there is a great sci-fi, highbrow epic in there. I just think that idea could have been presented, and then it just needed a comprehensive, like top to bottom story restructuring, and I think it could have pulled off. I just think a lot of it is the execution.
That's fair. That's fair. There's a good pitch meeting in there, but after the pitch meeting left that room, everything just went downhill.
I also think I don't want to go too much on a rabbit trail to crap on Ridley Scott, but I'm going to crap on Ridley Scott here for a second. I do think he's a very overrated director. I think he's definitely had a lot of hits, not really any in the past many couple years. And I also think he's also had a lot of duds that a lot of people don't realize. And I think especially sort of what I said about like trying to do this highbrow thing with like Blade Runner and Prometheus. I don't know if this is a hot take about Ridley Scott. I think he A wants to be and B thinks he is a very intellectual filmmaker, but I don't think he is. I think he thinks that he's this really deep thinker, intellectual, but he's just not. And that's why a lot of his films try to tackle a lot of these big issues and then just totally fumble it.
It's interesting because I think I am an example of what you just said. I think Alien is such a great movie that I was willing to watch Blade Runner because of it. And I've watched a lot of his movies because of how much I liked Alien. And so, yeah, I'm just a walking example. I would agree. I would think that his couple of successes are enough for people to look past the duds. And I think this could be a discussion for another time, but how much should a director's entire filmography weigh into how good they are if they've done a couple hits? Like, how like is there a give and take? Is there a certain abstract number that you have in your head of when you start to consider this director bad, or that it could be an interesting discussion, but we don't have to do that at the moment.
For sure. So I agree. I do not say that I love that movie either. I would say it's definitely kind of overrated for the at least in the film community.
All right, so I will say that my fear was unwarranted. That went better than expected. And before I forget, because I know I mentioned earlier, based off the movies that you put on your list, I all of a sudden expected you to have Soylent Green on your list. And we don't have to go into complete depth, but let's just say an honorable mention to talk about. What are your thoughts on Soylent Green?
I love it. I mentioned it in I think I mentioned it when I talked about Charlton Heston and Ben-Hur. I
Okay.
actually saw it for the first time literally a couple months ago. I think it was. Um, because it was one of those like it's a later Charlton Heston movie because it came out in like the mid 70s, so he was getting kind of older. I really dug it. I think it was a very well done sort of sci-fi mystery thriller. I was really compelled by Heston's character. I thought he had a great performance. I thought the world was really cool, like the world building and the lore. And I think it explored it like an appropriate amount. And I actually think it's something that could benefit from a remake,
Yeah, okay.
especially like with
I
with the modern world the way that it is. I think that we're seeing a lot more truth to it than we'd like, and I think there could be something interesting to go there. Not necessarily like an origins movie of like the start of that world, but I think there's an interesting idea there to explore that I'm surprised never got explored in like a remake already or a TV show or a sequel.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I really enjoy this movie. I feel like when I talk to people or when I see stuff online, there's a general dislike for this movie, at least in our generational age range. So I was just curious. But yeah, no, I actually really enjoy this movie, so I was curious your thoughts.
Definitely, definitely a good one. Kind of a hot, not a hot take, like a deep dive because I feel like the general audience doesn't really know much about that. It's not like as popular as like a Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, I think its twist is what makes it popular because I often see that ranked as one of the greatest twists in movie history. But then you'll reference it and people are like, "Well, what's Soylent Green? I don't understand."
So definitely check out Soylent Green, everyone, if you have not seen it.
Yes. The moral of this entire discussion is watch Soylent Green.
For sure.
Well, thank you again for talking, and I hope everybody enjoyed.